the book is about a radical shift to the right in American politics that occurred in the 1970s, in foreign policy and in also economic policy. Much of what you now call neoliberalism really got going in the 70s. And also, as I said, the shift in foreign policy towards militarism had occurred in the 70s. And it's usually attributed by most studies to change in public opinion and public culture. But the public opinion polls show exactly the opposite. The public didn't favor these changes. They were not supported by the public at all. All right, but they occurred anyway in spite of the public, basically. And that's a very striking development. And so whatever the cause of the change, it wasn't the public. And I argue the cause of the change occurred at the elite level, that wealthy individuals, including the military-industrial complex, but others as well, were suffering from low rates of profit, which were historically low in the 70s. And as a result of that, they engaged in a massive amount, they invested money in politics and engaged in, yes, what I define as deep lobbying, which is an effort to lobby not just the government, but the whole public, the whole climate of opinion, everything. When one thinks of lobbying, at least in the United States, I don't know how it's seen in Sweden, one thinks of, corporate groups setting up lobbies near the legislature and trying to influence legislators on policy matters. But I think deep lobbying works by trying to change the whole ideology. And a key element they use is to use academics, professors like me, to put them on the payroll and to use them as kind of platforms, as spokespeople for corporate interests. And right-wing ideologies supported by corporate interests. Milton Friedman, for example, is a classic example of this. There are many, many others. He was very heavily supported by corporate interests. He benefited from the policies he advocated for. And I think it's a bit of a surprise to many people, because I think, again, at least in the US, professors are thought of as A, very independent, and B, very left-wing and radical and contrarian and so on. I think mostly that's a myth. I think it mostly comes from cultural issues relating to gender, race, and sexuality. I guess in those issues, you could say the university system is left-wing, if you want to call that left-wing. But on issues of economics and foreign policy, that's really not true at all. And a great many professors are on the payroll of corporate interest is very common. Also, certain elite government interests, notably the CIA, a lot of political scientists, my degree is in political science actually, are on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency. I know some of them personally. This is a new kind of law. It's not a new kind of lobbying. It's a different type of lobbying from what people think. And it's much more effective than the old-fashioned type because it doesn't look like lobbying. It doesn't look like politics at all. It just looks like dissemination of ideas. Then when you dig, you find out that it's being funded by people with an interest in these ideas at a very heavy level. And so I think that's really what happened. That's the story of the 1970s and the shift to the right is deep lobbying. And that's my explanation for why it happened. That's why you've had this enormous concentration of wealth described by the French economist Thomas Piketty in the United States and in Europe. I would say it was resulted mostly from policy changes related to extended periods of deep lobbying. Now, with regard to foreign policy, this is the same thing. You had deep lobbying in the form of the Committee on the Present Danger, heavily funded by the military-industrial complex, using top-tier academics. It was headed by a professor at Yale. It was very effective in changing public opinion. And then, or I should say, it didn't change public opinion, it changed elite opinion. In other words, the policy-making process. The public really didn't change its opinion at all. It remained hostile to these policies, which is the amazing thing. But the policy changed, I think, because deep lobbying is aimed primarily at the higher levels, not the general public. I think with the general public, there was an effort to sort of bread and circuses, shall we say. In America, for example, there was the rise of evangelical Christianity. You don't really have that much in Northern Europe, barely exists. But in the US, a huge percentage of the population are not only Christian, but they take the Old Testament literally, all right? And there was a tremendous explosion of this in the 70s for a variety of reasons. What I think people tend to forget is corporate interests were funding neoliberal economics and militarism, also funded evangelical Christianity. And in private, they said, we're doing it because we want to divide the public and distract them. And it'll be much easier to push through the policies we're really interested in. If people are talking about, morality and, Jesus Christ and that kind of thing, all right? And so that was the game they were playing. I think, we still have that going on in the United States. I haven't studied directly the European experience to the same degree, but I'm sure it's going on here too. You do indeed have deep lobbying going on with regard to NATO expansion. I've mentioned one example, the Committee to Expand NATO. It was in the newspapers as being funded by corporations that are going to benefit from NATO expansion, which is exactly why they were doing it. And I'm sure if you start getting people doing research on this, going to the archives, you will find much more extensive involvement by corporate interests that led to the big question in Sweden and in Finland is how on earth did you guys go from being neutral, in Sweden's case for hundreds of years, to shifting and becoming a member of NATO? It's a conundrum, and especially since I can't imagine what Sweden's getting out of it in terms of security. Sweden had much higher security when they were neutral. But, it's happening. And the question is, why is it happening? My guess would be, and again, this is just speculation, is there was a massive influence campaign by interests both in the United States and maybe in Britain, spending money in Sweden, as well as Swedish interests, aimed at transforming public discussion in Sweden in favor of joining NATO. That's my guess.